Hello and welcome to Safety Tavern's video on emergency action plans. Let's get right at it. 1926-35 Alpha, Scope, and Application. This section applies to all emergency action plans required by our particular OSHA standard. So if another OSHA standard, if another OSHA regulation says you must have an emergency action plan, this is when you use this plan. The emergency action plan shall be in writing. This is what writing looks like. This is what talking looks like. The emergency action plan shall be written down and legible and shall cover those designated actions employers and employees must take to ensure employee safety from fire and other emergencies. Bravo. The following elements at a minimum shall be included. Shall means you have to include it. It doesn't mean you have the option. It doesn't mean it's a good idea. It's not a recommendation. It means you have to have this in there. Bravo 1, emergency escape procedures and emergency escape route assignments. Let's take a look at a couple of emergency evacuation maps from other buildings, other companies, other situations. I'm not saying that these are all bad, but there are some issues with this. This first one, does this look logical to you? Can you tell me where you're supposed to escape, how you're supposed to escape? Here's an evacuation map, and I'm sorry that it's a little bit blurry, but apparently we're here. And there's a million different ways to evacuate from a million different places. So why would you have all of these green arrows? I can tell you what's happened here. They made one map and then they just moved the red "you're here" dot. They moved it around based off of the building or the room that they were in. This is not acceptable. If you're going to have one map, you must cater the evacuation route to where the person is standing looking at the map. This is unacceptable. This is confusing. How about this one? Where's the evac route? Where's the rally point? I have no. What am I supposed to do in an emergency? This one's pretty decent. I've got my rally points up here. I am standing right here. But when you first look at this map, are your eyes immediately drawn to where you're at? And that's where, when you build these emergency evacuation maps, the biggest thing on there should be you are here. Just like when you're at the mall and you're looking at the map, you shouldn't have to hunt to figure out where you are. Think about this in emergency terms. Your adrenaline's going to be pumping. Everyone's going to be, there could be loud noises. Who knows what's going on? And you're having to look to figure out where you're at. That's insanity. Also, take a look here. Does this mean that if people are on fire, they are to evacuate here, but if you're handicapped and you're on fire, then you evacuate over here? Now, granted, I know what they're saying is this is a stairwell, and if you're handicapped, don't go this way. But here's the problem. Look right here. The primary route is not the handicap route. Make your primary route your handicap accessible route. Make your secondary one the one that's for all personnel that are non-handicap. Your primary is handicap accessible. Your secondary is not handicap accessible. But here's the problem. What if the fire's right there? You're standing here, the fire's right there. How are you going to get these people out? You got a problem. What about this exit right here? What does this area lead into? Could this be an additional route out of the building? You're limiting yourself, especially since you're recognizing that you have a handicap accessible area. You're limiting where your people can get into and out of the building. How about this one? Now, I don't like all this extra stuff up here, but this is pretty decent. I would make the green image of the person, I would make that dominantly bigger than the fire extinguisher ones, but we have very clearly we have our primary evacuation route and we have our secondary route. Bravo 2, procedures to be followed by employees who remain to operate critical plant operations before they evacuate. These could be security guards. They could be people that have to shut things down on the way out. Gas pumps, that's a very specific one for a gas station attendant. Anything that's going to potentially take this emergency and turn it into a catastrophic emergency, those are critical plant operations personnel. They need to be listed out exactly what they are supposed to do and how they are supposed to get into safe areas themselves. Bravo 3, procedures to account for all employees after emergency evacuation has been completed. So the emergency, we've gotten everyone out of the building. How do we count for everybody? We need to make sure every single employee that is within our domain is accounted for. Pretty simple, right? Bravo 4, rescue and medical duties for those employees who are to perform them. Now, this could include CPR, first aid. It could include fire brigade. It could include any myriad or any random number of different emergencies, how to respond to them, how do we deal with them, who do you want to do what? With my electrical experience, I know that going to check all of the electrical rooms could be something, especially if we have flooding going on. We need to go check the electrical rooms. Who does that? What equipment do they need with them? This is where we start. It's not just the paramedics getting into the situation. It's not just the GC nurse, if you have one, getting to them, getting to the injured people. It could very well be you're going to be the equipment operator if we need to use a forklift. Make sense? Wow, why would you need to use a forklift if we're having an emergency situation? Because you may need to pull some scaffolding, lift it up to where we can get people out from under it because the scaffolding fell down. This is an emergency action plan. Do you know what are all the emergencies that could pop up? And that's where we need to list out some of the people that could assist in the medical situation, assisting in the rescue, who's responsible for these things. At the very least, I would have one person that's in charge of all employees on the job site that are not doing anything. And that's kind of a pool of people that you can pull if the situation is controlled, if it is safe, and now we can start helping or assisting in any way to help people. This is what we're looking for. CPR and AED people, they may need to be in there. AED meaning the defibrillator. They may need to be called upon. This is why we have these kind of people on job sites. Bravo 5, the preferred means of reporting fires and other emergencies. So this is very simple. What is our communication method? Are we going to send runners, people that literally just walk around telling other people things? That's called sending a runner. Are we going to use telephones? Some people, especially some job sites, your carrier may not work really well in the building. If phone reliability is ever an issue, then it's probably not best to use these cell phones or these types of communication devices. A lot of job sites, if they're big enough, they'll have radios. But if you have radios, again, you need to start looking at what channels are we going to report them on and who switches over to what channel. We've had 40 radios on one job site before, and if there was an emergency, everybody would have had to have switched over to different channels. And we've had emergencies before where we switched over to a different channel to have a medical emergency channel where we were communicating things, and then several other channels were dedicated just for specific minor ops to deal with that medical emergency. Like one channel was specifically isolated just for walking the paramedics all the way up to the site. These are kinds of things where you'll want to have a controller. You'll want to have one person that says, okay, you two switch over to this channel. That way y'all can talk all you want. You people, this is where you'll want to have these kind of control things. Now, how are we going to pass information around? How are we going to report this issue, right? Because assuming you're the employer, you potentially have a general contractor. How are you going to report it to the GC? How are we going to report it to our employees and say, hey, there's an emergency here. This is how we're going to give you information, okay? We'll get into signals in a minute, but this is how we're going to give you information about, okay, it's all clear, come on back. How are we going to do this? Bravo 6, names or regular job titles of persons or departments who can be contacted for further information or explanation of duties under the plan. So this is a very common thing. For fire, call these people. For medical emergency, call 911. For chemical spill, call this group. Have your safety data sheet binder, your SDSs or your MSDSs, whatever you want to call them. Have your binder of large quantities of chemicals on site right here. That's where you'd have your evac plan, and you'd also have a known locations of chemicals plan. There's several kinds of things that you're going to want to have in this binder, if you will, or maybe it's just a folder, maybe it's a smaller job site. And overall, it's who do you call for what emergencies? If there's an active shooter, who do we call? Do we call just 911, or do we call the Brazoria County Sheriff's Department? Like, who do we call? And when you're setting up this initial job site, this is the stage where you're really going to want to look at this. But we'll get into how often you should review it. But you really need to pay a lot of attention to this, especially at the beginning stages, because if an emergency happens and you have not planned anything, you have nothing written on anything, you just depended on the GC, you could walk yourself down a bad road. Supervisors and foremen, you've got to lay out some kind of a plan for how your employees are to deal with emergencies. I would even take it a step further and say you need to put their phone numbers down here too. Okay, I can see where it says job titles, but what they're really going for there is the night shift supervisor is the one responsible for all these things. Okay, but I would rather put the night shift supervisor's name and number on there. Does it mean we're going to have to modify the form if he quits or gets fired? Yes. Or if he gets rotated to day shift? Yes. That's fine. We can do that. But we want to make sure that our people have, if they've looked at the emergency action plan, that they have access to that person's phone number. If you're not using phones as a means of communication, then what radio channel? Like how are we supposed to be able to get a hold of these people? That's where, remember, we just covered this, but this is where these things really come into play. Charlie 1. The employer shall establish an employee alarm system which complies with 1926-159. And just for fun, let's go look at 1926-159, and yeah. So we need to have an alarm system, and we don't really have any rules or regulations on what it should be like. It could be a loud siren. I wouldn't make it like any other sound that could potentially be on the job site. I've had some job sites that they would use an air horn, and they said the GC would say, if you hear 3 long blasts of an air horn, that's the emergency signal. Problem is, those air horns, they often sound a whole lot like other horns. So be careful with that. As long as everybody understands, then okay. But everyone needs to understand, and their ears need to be listening for that horn. If that's the case, then you need to practice it. You need to do the drills. You need to make sure that we're all doing a test. Everyone knows what the air horn sounds like. Okay, let's test the air horn. I had one GC that they actually had an emergency. They brought out their air horn to test it, and, well, their safety assistant had been playing with the air horn, joking around and all that, and ran it out. So they had an emergency signal that they couldn't use. And so that's where you need to be testing everything, make sure that everything's good to go very periodically. If you are looking at this video going, well, that's a GC thing. Cool. Did you see anywhere on this that says general contractor? GC, right? Or do you see employer? Who do these people work for? Do they work for the GC or do they work for you? You're responsible for this. And if something fails with this, you will be the one that's held responsible for this, not the GC. And granted, the GC will get wrapped into the court case too, of course. But in the end, it's going to be you. You're going to be the one that's held responsible. I wouldn't just trust GCs. As good as they are, and as wonderful as all of our general contractors are in the entire country of America, I would still make sure that that everything makes sense, everything's laid out, and if there are gaps in the GC's plan, write your own plan, employers. You have a responsibility. If everything checks out, I see no problem with you taking the GC's emergency action plan and adopting it as your own for this one project. Got no problem with that. Make sure that it fits all the requirements. Make sure it's going to keep us as safe as possible, and make sure that, well, we'll get to the talking to the employees in a minute. Charlie 2, if the employee alarm system is used for alerting fire brigade members or for other purposes, a distinctive signal for each purpose shall be used. If it's specifically targeting a team, they need to have their own alarm signal that everyone knows. That doesn't mean everyone evacuate. That is just for that team. Delta, evacuation. The employer shall establish in the emergency action plan the types of evacuations to be used in emergency circumstances. I've heard many a GC say, if you hear 2 blasts of the air horn, that means go to rally point 1. If you hear 3 blasts of an air horn, that means go to rally point 2. Okay, that's getting more specific, and what they're trying to say is if we think this is the safer place to go here. If we think that's a safer place to go. That's not what this is saying. What this is saying is the type of evacuation. So let's say a freak tornado just landed half a mile away from the job site. Shouldn't there be an evacuation horn for shelter in place? Yeah, that's where, if you hear 3 loud blasts of an air horn, shelter in place. Seek shelter wherever you can right now, because there's something impending here. That would also be active shooter situations. If you can't get everyone out safely, everyone shelters in place. Just stop moving and hide. Everyone hide. The next one would be 2 blasts of an air horn, if you're using an air horn, and that would be everyone go to the rally points. These are the different types. 35E training, E1. Before implementing the emergency action plan, the employer shall designate and train a sufficient number of persons to assist in the safe and orderly emergency evacuation of employees. Pretty simple. However many people you need to conduct this evacuation safely, train them. And then me personally, I would train almost everybody that's necessary times 2. Because that way, if that person's sick that one day, you don't have a big ball being dropped and a bunch of people get hurt just because you forgot to open this one door, forgot to lock this one door, or forgot to turn in the recall roster. So everybody stood around for an extra hour and a half because the guy who turns in the recall roster, he was sick that day. Echo 2. The employer shall review the plan with each employee covered by the plan at the following times. Initially, when the plan is developed, whenever the employee's responsibility or designation actions under the plan change, and when the plan is changed. Pretty simple, right? You first make the plan, and then when they get on the job site, and then when something changes. Echo 3, the employer shall review with each employee upon initial assignment those parts of the plan which the employee must know to protect the employee in the event of an emergency. The written plan shall be kept at the workplace and made available for employee review. That means your employees have to have access to this written plan. That means you can't keep it as a supervisor. You can't just keep it in your desk and nobody gets to get into your desk because they don't know where it's at. For those employers with 10 or fewer employees, the plan may be communicated orally to employees and the employer need not maintain a written plan. You understand that doesn't say per job site, right? You got that. I don't see anywhere where it says per job site. That says employers with 10 or fewer. Do you have 11 people employed by your company? Period. So if OSHA applies to you, write your plan down. Even if it's a quick little writing, I would type it out, but even if it's a quick little writing, if there's a fire, we're going to meet over here. If there's a blah, 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 we're going to meet over there. It doesn't have to be this crazy, elaborate, drawn out, printed on 15 different kinds of card stock and everything's color coded perfectly. It doesn't have to be the most amazing plan, but you need to be telling your people what to do in the event of an emergency. Let's look at some of the emergencies that might happen. Fire, active shooter, chemical release, bomb threats, tornadoes, earthquake. Now, you may be saying, well, we never have those kind of situations, or from the work we do, we never have to deal with that kind of stuff. Okay, what about scaffolding? You know how often scaffolding falls down? Scaffolding falls down quite a bit, or hitting a gas line. I've been with electrical companies for quite a long time, and I would love to say my guys are perfect, but every now and again, yep, 811 dig, pretty simple. But here's the problem with 811. They're only going to tell you the public utilities. They're not going to tell you what the customer put in the ground. That's where you need to figure out what's in the ground before you dig. A lot of companies don't do it. Boom. Now you have fireball explosion. What is every single person that's employed, what are they supposed to do in the event of a natural gas leak that's caught on fire? What are you supposed to do? Take care of your people. Look at your emergency action plans. Make sure that they're relevant. Every time your supervisor changes, make sure that the plan still works. If you're a supervisor showing up to a job site, go get the plan. If the plan doesn't make any sense, change it. Fix it. Make it make sense. If the rally point doesn't make sense, I've literally seen an emergency action plan. In the event of a fire, we're going to rally at the gas station across the street. Does that make sense? Or how about in the event of a tornado, we're going to rally here? Does any of this make sense? Your plan needs to make sense. Get your people from point A to point B safely, get them accounted for, and if you need to get them, tell them to go home, tell them to go home. If you need to, after you account for them, right? Because you got to account for everybody. Make sure every single person is there. And me personally, any job that I was on, it was I want to see that person, or I want one of my superintendents to see that person. If you're a smaller company that's on that job, maybe 3 people, good to go. 1, 2, 3, yep, we're all here. Call your GC, tell them we're all here, then call the home office or your supervisor and say, hey, this is what happened. It's pretty simple. Emergency action plans, hopefully you never have to use them. And if you do have to use them, hopefully they work right. And hopefully, nobody gets hurt because you didn't have one. Emergency action plans. Do what you got to do.